quiet very suddenly. Good evening, everyone. Hi. For those who don't know, my name is John Schwabish. I'm a senior fellow here at the Urban Institute. We're very happy to welcome you to tonight's event, and of course, Urban's new building here at LaFont Plaza. For those who don't know, Urban is a nonprofit research organization, and together we believe that decisions should be shaped by facts rather than ideology. We believe that facts have the power to improve public policy and practice, strengthen communities, and transform people's lives for the better. In that vein, I personally am very excited for tonight's event that should help all of us do a better job analyzing, visualizing, and communicating our data. And we have a great evening prepared for you. Our featured speaker is Alberto Cairo, the Knight Chair in Visual Journalism at the University of Miami School of Communication, and the author of the new book, How Charts Lie. Following Alberto's presentation, we're going to be joined by 3 members of the Washington, D.C. data visualization community to talk about issues related to creating and reading misleading charts and graphs. And we'll leave a good amount of time at the end for questions after the panel discussion. If you are sharing on social media, which would be great, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban, and we'll share all that information with folks. And we are also live streaming tonight's event, and we're also recording it for posterity and for your friends who couldn't make it. And also a quick word of thanks to all of you for attending, of course, and to the Urban's events team and the Urban facilities team for helping arrange tonight's food, the live stream, the video recording that will be on YouTube. And so now on to the main event. So tonight's featured speaker is Alberto Cairo. Alberto's new book, How Charts Lie, is a succinct, accessible look at the ways data can be represented or misrepresented. A leader in the data visualization and data journalism fields, Alberto brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to helping us all understand how we can be better communicators and consumers of data. And reading the book this past week, I thought this passage from the introduction is a perfect summary of why this is such an important topic. Charts, even those not designed with ill intent, can mislead us. However, they can also tell us the truth. Well-designed charts are empowering, they enable conversations, they imbue us with X-ray vision, allowing us to peek through the complexity of large amounts of data. Charts are often the best way to reveal patterns and trends hidden behind the numbers we encounter in our lives. Good charts makes us smarter. I hope you join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Alberto Cairo.
All right, is this on? Are you hearing me? Or is this on? Perfect. Well, thank you again thank you to the Urban Institute for hosting me tonight. Thank you to John. Thank you, John, for spoiling the entire talk because he basically summarized the main points that I was going to make. But yeah, that's a great summary. That's what the book is about. I'm a great believer in the fact that charts can enable great conversations. And if there is something that this country and other countries that I'm familiar with, such as Brazil, where I lived for several years, or Spain, etc. All of them are going to, huge turmoils. If there is something that all these countries need is better conversations among people who really care about the truth, people who really care about facts. And sometimes charts can really inform those conversations. That's the whole purpose of the book. How Charts Lie has a title that sounds really negative, How Charts Lie, right? But it's really, the title is sort of like a trick to attract more readers because it certainly shows how charts can lie, but it's more about how we lie to ourselves with them and how, contrary to that, how we can use them better and how we can become better chart readers. Anyway, a little bit of housekeeping. Right after I finish talking and before the panel, I'm going to tweet out the slides that I'm going to show here today. I have already exported them as a PDF file. These slides are not copyrighted. That means that if you want to use them in your classes, if you teach classes, or in your companies, if you want to give a similar lecture to these, etc., you should feel free to use these slides at will without asking for my permission, okay? So I have the tweet ready to be sent out. I already written it. Anyway, so I don't think that I tell you anything new if I say that charts are everywhere, right? It's like we see them everywhere. My PhD dissertation, which I finished like a couple of years ago, fortunately, deals and explains why this has happened. Why do we see today more data visualizations than in the past, right? What factors contribute to that, right? We see data visualizations I use indistinctly charts and data visualizations, by the way, in the book and also in the talk. Why that has happened? Well, because charts are very popular. It's like people like charts. When you publish a story or a tweet or a Facebook post and you include some sort of a map or a graph or an infographic or a visual explanation, that story usually increases in terms of engagement. The engagement with that story increases. That's the reason why we see more data visualizations in the usual suspects, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Axios, 538, et cetera, right? So it's that charts are popular. Some of the most popular pieces of content published by many of these websites and publications are actually data visualizations. The most popular, I think that I'm not wrong in saying this, but the most popular piece of content ever published by the New York Times Online is a data visualization commonly called as the dialect map. You can Google that app, right? So that's an extremely popular piece of content. So people really like to see charts. But the question is, do they really understand the charts that they see, right? And what we can do about that, right? Through my observations throughout the years, both scientific and non-scientific, mostly non-scientific, I have come to believe that there is a gap, what we could call an epistemic gap, between what we could call the experts, that means probably most of you here in this room who are visualization designers, data scientists, scientists of different kinds, statisticians. I call you all the experts, and you are on that end of the spectrum. And then we have the general public over here, right? People who are non-experts, right? Well, this gap in between these two groups of people, I tend to believe, this is just a hunch, I don't have data to back me up on these, that this gap is increasing, right? And why do I believe that this happens? Well, because if you take a look at the progress in data visualization in particular in the past 10 years, it has been enormous. New graphic forms, new ways to represent data, new technologies, virtual reality, augmented reality, and so on and so forth, new tools to represent data, programming languages. There has been new methods to represent graphically information. There has been a lot of progress in the world of data visualization, and I tend to believe that the people who benefit the most from this progress is ourselves. And the question is how we can help everybody else also take advantage of the wonders of data visualization, how we can send back a rope and help everybody else bring themselves up to speed with all these new technologies. How can we democratize data visualization? I am obsessed with this idea. How we can show people that data visualization is not magic, that data visualization is extremely powerful for anybody, and anybody can jump into it and start doing it and practicing it if we just understand certain principles. I do believe that people like myself and people like most of you probably on that end of the spectrum, perhaps we need to stop talking so much about new technologies, the novelties, new tools that we use, and so on and so forth, the new innovation out there, and we need to start talking a little bit more about how to bring everybody else up to speed, how we can spread the knowledge of data visualization. Today I'm going to be recommending tons of books. I love books. I believe that reading is one of the best ways to learn anything. The first book that I would recommend you all today is Ruined by Design by designer Mike Monteiro, who has that wonderful quote in the book, right? I'm not going to read it all, only the last part. We need to value the consequences of our actions more than the cleverness of our ideas. These rang a bell for me. It's like sometimes I think that the data visualizations that I see sometimes look wonderful to me, but sometimes they look overly complicated or too busy or too dense, too smart. They try to be too smart rather than being clear, which is what they should do, right? They seem like they have been designed for people like me, right? Who can read data visualization and who works in data visualization on a regular basis. So how can we help everybody else bring themselves up to speed with data visualization? We could all begin, for example, by helping people abandon certain myths in relationship to data visualization. For example, the ever-present "a picture is worth 1,000 words," which is not true. It is only true if you really know how to read that picture. If you don't know how to read that picture, the picture will not be worth 1,000 words, as I will prove to you in just 1 second. Or visualization is intuitive. People don't read anymore, so let's make a map, let's make a graph. Well, that's dangerous because I will show it to you later, and I talk at length in How to Fly. Visualizations are not images. Visualizations are visual arguments. Therefore, they need to be read. They cannot just be seen. You need to understand their grammar and their symbols in order to be understood. The next one is very common in the world of business analytics. The data should speak for itself. Just show me the data. Well, careful with that, because data never speaks for itself, for themselves. All right, if you are a language sort of nerd, data is singular for me. Anyway, or it can be plural also. All right, it's both plural and singular. Anyway, data should speak for themselves or itself. Well, no, because it's not data that matters. What really matters is the interpretation of the data. How you make the data talk, right? And show, don't tell. This is very common in the world that I come, one of the worlds that I come from, the world of graphic design. Well, we need to show and tell, not show, don't tell, right? Anyway, so because if we don't show and tell, several misunderstandings may happen because images can be greatly ambiguous. This is an example. I guess that all of you know how to read this picture, right? If you drink coffee from Dunkin' Donuts, probably you're familiar with Dunkin' Donuts' slogan, which is, let me see if this is working, America runs on Dunkin'. We all know how to read that. Why? Because someone told us how to read this picture. But if nobody told you how to read this picture, you will ask yourself, why is this person running away from the United States? I mean, that may make sense nowadays, but, you know, why? I don't understand. All right, so, and I have a story really in relationship to these. So 4 years ago, my little daughter, she's 8 right now, but she was 4 the first time that she saw that picture. And she asked me a question about that picture. In perfect British accent, by the way, because at the time she was watching a show called Peppa Pig, which is a British show. If you have children, you know what I'm talking about. So my daughter asked me, Daddy, why is that person waving from inside a toilet? And then I realized that she was seeing that. She was seeing a tilted toilet and a person coming out of the toilet and waving her hand, or his hand, right? Then I tweeted this out because I found it so funny, obviously, the ambiguity, the intrinsic ambiguity of the picture. I found it so funny that I tweeted it out. And someone replied to me on Twitter saying, well, that doesn't look like a person coming out of a toilet. It looks like a person waving from behind a martini glass, which is another possible interpretation of that picture. So that's sort of a joke, but it's actually a very illuminating joke, I think, because if something as simple as that picture can be so ambiguous, imagine what happens with data visualizations if we don't explain them to readers. Interpretations will be all over the place, and we have tons of evidence to show that. Some of you know, for example, that one of the pet peeves that I have and that I have talked about extensively is how people misinterpret hurricane maps. So let me go back to this example and try to go way beyond how Chadsley explained. Because, by the way, this talk goes beyond the book. It's not about the book itself, is about what I have been working on since I finished writing the book, right? Anyway, so this is Hurricane Dorian on September the 1st, right? That cone over there is called the cone of uncertainty, right? But we know that, and this is from a TV station that was showing where Hurricane Dorian may go in the next 5 days, right? Well, many people, and this includes TV newscasters, believe that this graphic is very simple to read, that it's very intuitive. It looks very intuitive, but it's very deceptive if you believe that it is really intuitive. This is what the National Hurricane Center publishes on a regular basis, right? So what happens very often is that when the National Hurricane Center delivers this map, media organizations crop the legend out. And that is very dangerous because then people will start asking, why is there a difference between the cone over there and the cone up there, right? What that's actually representing is that this area in gray over here represents where the hurricane may go on 1 day, 2 days, and 3 days from now. And then this area that is dotted over here represents where the hurricane may be in day 4 and day 5 from now. If you crop the legend out, interpretations will be all over the place. We actually observe that scientifically, empirically in Miami. People say, well, that looks like rain. It's probably area that is going to be covered by rain, right? That's a very legitimate interpretation if you don't explain to people what it is that they are seeing. We also know that the cone itself is problematic. We know that when people see that cone, they interpret the cone as an area under threat. They see the cone and they actually envision something like that, right? If I am inside of the cone, I am in danger. If I am outside of the cone, I am fine. But that is not how to read that map. So how to read that map very quickly? I don't want to bore you to tears because this is explained in the book. But basically what the map is representing is a set of possible positions and paths of the center of the hurricane in the past 5 days. The National Hurricane Center collects tons of data. They create tons of forecast models. That's step number one. Then they choose what they consider like their own model. That's step number two. And they pinpoint what they deem that is going to be the possible position of the center of the storm in the next 5 days. Then they surround those circles with those little dots with circles of increasing size, which represents the uncertainty. They're basically telling you, well, we estimate that it's going to be here, but it could be here, 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 right? And in some cases, it will be outside those circles because the cone only contains 66, 67% of the forecast. There is a 1 of 3 chance that the center of the storm may end up going outside the boundaries of the cone, which is what many people are not aware of. Right? And that's actually crucial to interpreting this visualization correctly. And then they surround the circles with the line and they erase the circles, and the result is called the cone of uncertainty. What have I done here? I have shown you and I have told you. Now that I have told you, you're ready to see, you're ready to interpret. But if I hadn't told you how to read this visualization, if I hadn't increased your visual literacy, the interpretation of these maps on your part will be all over the place. This is just in case if you ever entertain the possibility of moving to Florida. Now you know how to read it, which is, by the way, it's a great place to be if you want to retire. I'm so almost like pre-retire already, living down there. Anyway, so continuing with Hurricane Dorian, this is the forecast for August the 31st. As you may remember, Dorian was still predicted to go over the eastern coast of Florida. But then in the morning of September the 1st, this was a Sunday, the National Hurricane Center published this update of the forecast showing that the hurricane was predicted to move close to the shoreline, but closer to the sea, basically, to the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so I saw these very early in the morning on September the 1st, which was a Sunday. They published this at 5 a.m., but I saw it sort of like a 7 a.m. And at 8 a.m., 8-something a.m., the President of the United States published the following tweet. He said, in addition to Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, fine, yes, sure, and Alabama. I said, Alabama? Well, Alabama is going to be hit by the storm? What the hell is he talking about? Alabama is not part of the forecast. I mean, there's always a small, tiny probability, as I said before, that the hurricane may end up going in a different direction, but the probability is so low, so tiny, right, that it doesn't really make sense to put Alabama on the same footing as all the other states, which were going to be affected by the storm almost for sure. Well, as you may remember, President Trump refused to correct this tweet because this tweet was wrong. It was so wrong, in fact, that many Alabamians were so alarmed that they started phoning the local office of the National Hurricane Center in Alabama, alarmed, saying, oh, the president is saying that we are going to be affected. And the National Hurricane Center in Alabama issued a tweet correcting the president. Apparently, the president was furious about that. And he doubled down, saying, yes, Alabama is going to be affected. And you may remember that a few days later, he had a public briefing in the White House in which he got a very early cone of uncertainty from August the 30th. Not from September the 1st, which is when the tweet was published. And as you may remember, he showed that map over there, and he doctored that map with a Sharpie. Obviously, this case was it's commonly called a Sharpie gate already. Now, you can approach this story as a joke because it's a funny story, actually. But actually, I think that there is something deeper into this story that is actually quite dangerous. It is dangerous not because of the manipulation of the map, but because of the consequences of all these turmoil that happened because of this case, which is that the credibility of these agencies, public agencies, is undermined by cases like these. And that is dangerous because the National Hurricane Center, I mean, they work really hard to inform the public about what the public needs to know. If you undermine their credibility, that's super, super dangerous and very irresponsible. Besides being illegal, you cannot really manipulate maps like that. In any case, why did the president believe that? I actually looked into it, right? And what I believe that it happened, and I think that I have some evidence to back me up on this, is that first of all, he didn't see the latest update that morning, the September the 1st update, and he remembered the maps from days before, which indeed showed that there was a low probability that Alabama might be affected, right? But something else happened, and I will get to that in just 1 minute. He saw, because he tweeted this out, maps such as this this one, right? This is a much earlier map from the Water Service showing tons of different forecasts, right? And he said, well, take a look. Many of the forecasts are actually showing that Alabama may be affected, right? He actually tweeted that. Now, the fake news media needs to apologize to me, whatever. But this is a perfect example of a map that illustrates why a picture is not worth 1,000 words. It's only worth 1,000 words if you know how to read it. And he doesn't know how to read it. And actually, the caption of the map is perfect to illustrate this, because the caption of the map down there says, if anything on this graphic causes confusion, ignore the entire product. That's the real caption. This is not Photoshop. When I saw that, I thought that it was so perfect that I actually considered that as the title of my next book. And I actually mocked a cover of the follow-up of the book. Obviously, it will not be the title of the next book, but I'm indeed using that as the title for an article that I'm currently writing, because I believe that this story is very illuminating. Now, so he probably was misled by the maps that he had seen before, and he didn't get the latest update that morning, but there is something else, and I will get to that once I finish talking about the next slide. So let's talk about first the map. Why does the misunderstanding about this map happen? Well, it happens because of mental models. Whenever you are designing any visualization, you have a mental model of how that visualization is supposed to work. You have an idea of the symbols, you have an idea of the colors, the legends, etc., the symbology, the encodings, and blah, blah, blah. You have that mental model in mind, which also explains the mechanism of the graphic. You apply that mental model, you design the graphic, but what happens is that you sometimes forget what happens on the other side of the spectrum, where you have a reader who may not have the same mental models as you do, who may come to the graphic, for example, remembering that he saw other types of map in which areas shaded and enclosed by a line were representing areas under threat. That's a very common visual metaphor. That's a different mental model. If you apply that mental model to the cone of uncertainty, there will be a mismatch between the mental model that the designer is using and the mental model that the reader is using. And when the mismatch happens, misunderstandings happens. Now, how can you bridge that gap, or how can we bridge that gap? Here comes the critical part. Another reason why Trump, I believe, tweeted that out is that he was not correctly briefed, even during, not only during that day, but only in days prior. Several news stories that I read about Sharpikhet explains that the people who briefed President Trump those days, none of them were atmospheric scientists. You need an atmospheric scientist to tell you how to read these maps correctly, or at least someone who has been working on these kinds of things for more than 2 years, so you sort of understand how the map is read. I call that kind of person a mediator. The role of the mediator, by the way, in this diagram is played by my friend Lena Groger, who works for ProPublica. I just have a portrait of her by many other friends, and I just feel free to use it over there. She's an amazing designer and also a journalist. Anyway, so journalists can also be mediators. One of the reasons why so many people in the public misinterpret these kinds of cone maps is that, and observe this, next time that you see a hurricane approaching, go watch TV news, and you will see that many not all of them, but many TV newscasters explain the map wrong. I remember, for example, when Hurricane Irma was approaching Miami, if you remember originally, if this is Florida, Miami is down here, originally Hurricane Irma was predicted to go over Miami, and everybody started preparing, closing the shutters, that's what we do down there. But then 2 days before the hurricane landed, the cone of uncertainty moved towards the west coast, and it ended up going over Naples and Tampa Bay. That's what happened with Irma. Well, I remember TV newscasters in Miami that saw the cone moving towards the west, and they started saying, well, it seems that Miami is going to be fine. It's not going to be affected by the hurricane. That's dangerous, and it perpetuates these kinds of misunderstandings. So the role of the mediators is critical. Journalists are mediators, right, for example, but scientists can also be mediators in cases like this. So what to do? One of the first things that we need to assume is that we can all play those three roles: the role of the designer, the role of the reader, and the role of the mediator. In many cases, we only play one role. We are just the designer, we are just the reader, we are just the mediator. But sometimes we play two of these roles. We can be both the designers and the mediators. So things that we can help people with. The first one is that we can all try to increase visual literacy or graphical literacy, help other people bring themselves up to speed. There's actually a word to refer to graphical literacy. It's graphicacy, right? I didn't invent this word, by the way. It's a word that has been around for more than 50 years. It appears in several books. For example, Mark Monmonier's Mapping It Out. Monmonier, by the way, is also the author of a wonderful book titled How to Lie with Maps, which I also recommend because it was one of my inspirations to write How Just Lie, obviously. It covers different topics, but it's a great, great book. Anyway, so Monmonier, in Mapping It Out, explains that nowadays, in order to obtain a well-rounded education, we need much more than literacy. That's very important, obviously. We need to teach people how to read and write, but we need much more than that. We also need articulacy. People need to have the ability, need to acquire the ability to express themselves correctly through verbal language. And they also need numeracy. What is numeracy? By the way, there's another wonderful book titled In Numeracy by John Allen Paulus, who is a mathematician. Great, great book. Try to get it. Anyway, so numeracy. What is numeracy? Well, numeracy is sort of like a combination of mathematical thinking, scientific thinking, statistics, but it doesn't equate any of those fields exclusively. It's a combination of everything. Numeracy is more like I would describe it as a sixth sense in the back of your brain that starts ringing an alarm when you see a number that doesn't look right, or when you see a graphic that it doesn't look correct. You don't know exactly why it doesn't look correct, but that sort of like little alarm in the back of your brain starts ringing, and it prompts you to look beyond the graphic, beyond the number, look at the source, etc. This sense of numeracy can be educated, and it can be developed. And I wish that it would be more taught in educational systems. And then as an extension of that, we have graphicacy, the ability to read data visualizations, which again is essential because they are becoming more and more common every single day. I would add, by the way, a fifth element to this thing. It's actually very, very close to recent interests of mine, which is that we can also train people to pay attention. Pay attention, becoming more aware of what is out there, but also becoming more aware of what happens here inside of our skulls whenever we see a piece of information. And I will get to what I mean by that. Becoming, in 1 minute, becoming more aware of, for example, cognitive biases or ideological biases. This can also be taught, and it can also be learned, and perhaps it needs to become part of the curriculum that we teach in middle schools and high schools and also at the college level, because we can teach it in a very systematic manner. There is something else that we can do to educate people and increase the level of graphicacy of people, which is to show and tell whenever we do a visualization. If you're going to do a visualization that you believe that is going to be slightly complicated for the audience that you're talking to, why don't you just show that, but you also explain how to read it? One person that you can look for inspiration from is Hans Rosling, Professor Hans Rosling, who sadly passed a couple of years ago. I believe that Rosling was one of the most influential figures in the history of data visualization and also presentations in general. He became famous in 2006 because of a presentation that he gave at the TED conferences, and then throughout the years he gave tons of presentations all over the world, and he published also a book called Factfulness. I would encourage you to watch several presentations by Rosling, not only because he was a great presenter, but also pay attention at how he described the content of his charts, and not only the content of his charts, he also talked about how to read his charts. He has a wonderful documentary titled The Joy of Stats, which he produced for the BBC. There's a very famous scene in this documentary in which he puts himself behind a chart and he describes that chart. So I'm going to show you that segment without sound. So he comes Rosling in front of the screen, and he says, well, I'm going to show you a chart. First, vertical axis. And the vertical axis, higher up we are, the higher the lifespan of the countries that I'm about to show you. Horizontal axis, the further to the right we are, the richer these countries are on average. This is probably the income per capita, right? Now, if you are down here, that means that these countries are poor and sick, right? If you are up here, it means that these countries are rich and healthy. In the past, I'm going to show you now the world as if it was like in 1810, right? In the past. And now I'm going to show you all the countries. Here come the countries. You have these countries, that country, that country, that country. Notice what he's doing. He's not describing the content of the chart. He's increasing the level of graphicacy of his audience, but by first explaining the grammar of that graphic, the symbols that are used in that graphic, but also the grammatical system that is used to describe or to encode the content of that chart. He also explains that the size of the bubble corresponds to the population of those countries. He does that before explaining the content. He also emphasizes the content itself. He's accomplishing two goals by doing that. First of all, he reinforces the main messages of the chart itself, but at the same time, he also increases the level of literacy, of visual literacy of the audience. We can all do this. It's not that hard, and it can really help a lot of people. There you go. And then he animates all the charts. These charts are incredibly beautiful. Second thing that we could do is to embrace complexity and teach other people to embrace complexity as well, right? We live in a society that goes too fast, that pays too little attention, that usually demands simplistic stories. We all like simplistic stories, but a simplistic story will rarely tell the truth. One of the worlds that I come from, the world of journalism, is very fond of talking about simplification. Let's simplify these, because people don't pay attention, people don't have time, they are rushed, blah, blah, blah. I usually prefer not to talk about to simplify things. I prefer to talk about to clarify things, because when you put yourself in the frame of mind of simplification, you may end up oversimplifying, and that's super, super dangerous. For example, take a look at this chart. There's nothing wrong with this chart. This chart is showing the murder rate in the United States since 1960 up to 2015. As you may know, well, it tells a story that the 80s and 70s and 80s it went up, went down during the 90s, stayed the same in the 2000s, and then in the past 2 or 3 years, 4 years, the murder rate in the United States has increased. This chart on its own is not it's not a lying chart, but it can be greatly misleading if you don't know how to read it well. It is very easy to describe this chart, and descriptions of charts can be really dangerous, right? The mental descriptions that we come up with whenever we see a chart can greatly bias the perception of that chart. This chart could be described wrongly as the United States is becoming a more dangerous country in the past 3 or 4 years. If you extend that line continues increasing, right? But that is not true. The United States is not becoming more dangerous. Only certain places are becoming more dangerous, right? If you take a look at the statistics, I quote several articles in How to Slide that talk about these crimes statistics. Most places in the United States are actually pretty safe. If we could plot every single place in the United States, it will be around the national rate, a little bit above it, a little bit below it. Most of them will be below it. What happens is that there are certain places, as I said before, that if we try to plot them in the chart, they will go through the roof. They are extreme values. They are outliers, right? Certain neighborhoods, certain cities that in the past few years have become so dangerous that they sort of skew the national rate. The point that I'm trying to get is that if you are a journalist, and I say this because I am a journalist, I have made every single mistake that I describe in the book. This is not false modesty, that is actually true. I've made all these mistakes myself. If you're a journalist, you will always be inclined to just show that. And that is not enough, because that's a simplification. When you combine that chart, though, with this explanation, that's a clarification. The impulse of journalists is usually to reduce the amount of data, and that's a noble goal, because you don't want to overwhelm people. But sometimes you can go too far. This is one of those cases in which you need to show more rather than showing less. How can we help ourselves to educate? How can we help other people and also ourselves in getting a little bit better about how to think about numbers and their representations? Fortunately, nowadays, there are tons of resources, tons of popular science books that introduce statistics and mathematical thinking, even if you are not a statistician. They recently published The Art of Statistics, for example, which is a wonderful intro, the already classic Naked Statistics by Charles Whelan, How Not to Be Wrong. Even certain intros to stats are highly readable, even if you are afraid of formulas, etc. Books such as Statistics Unplugged explains the formulas behind basic descriptive statistics in a very clear manner. So let's grow used to reading these books more often and recommend them to other people. Third, becoming more aware of our own biases. We need to learn how to pay more attention, and we also need to encourage people to pay more attention to the things that they see, because otherwise we will all fall victim to biases such as the cognitive bias known as the confirmation bias. We all lie to confirm what we already want to believe. One of the examples that I show in the book, for instance, I usually describe it as, let's say that you are a cigarette smoker and you love smoking, and you have grown tired of people telling you you need to stop smoking because smoking is really bad for your health. It is likely to shorten your life. And suddenly one day I show you that chart And that chart can be easily being described as the more we smoke, the longer we live. Take a look at that. The horizontal axis is annual cigarette consumption per country. Each one of the dots is a country. The vertical axis is life expectancy at birth in years. And as you can see, there is a positive association between the two variables, right? The higher the cigarette consumption, the higher the life expectancy. The description of the chart that I gave you, by the way, is very misleading, but it is the kind of description that a non-statistician will come up with when I see the chart. The more we smoke, the longer we live. But the chart is actually not showing that. What the chart is actually showing is that this is the actual description. At the national level, there's a positive association between cigarette consumption and life expectancy and vice versa. And that doesn't mean that these two things are causally connected. That's how to describe that chart correctly in order to avoid those biases. Because this chart is a perfect example to illustrate certain paradoxes that we all fall for regularly. For example, amalgamation paradoxes, also called Simpson's paradox. A pattern that you see at a certain level of aggregation, national level, may disappear or even reverse when you go down into the data, when you disaggregate the data. Why? Because there are several lurking variables over here. You're grouping different kinds of people together in a highly aggregated chart. When you start, for example, separating the countries by income or by wealth, the association completely disappears, or at least it vanishes, right? So wealth may be one of those lurking variables, right? The wealthier a country is, the more cigarettes people tend to consume in that country because they can afford to pay for them, perhaps. Or therefore, the life expectancy may lower because of that. But that gets balanced out by the increase of life expectancy due to the fact that people are richer, they can pay for better health care. They are probably not in countries that are the victims of civil war and stuff, so that increases life expectancy. So one thing compensates the other, right? This is all guesses, by the way. I'm not an expert on any of these, but these are the guesses that I would make to explain this lack of association. If we separate more, it completely disappears. This is all the countries separated by regions. And if you go down to the regional level, local level, down to the individual level, right, we have good evidence that shows that cigarette consumption is not good for your health. When you take a look at survival rate curves, right, people who don't smoke, in general, there are always exceptions, obviously, people who don't smoke tend to live a little bit longer than people who do smoke, because smoking leads to several diseases, right? So this is not just an example of an amalgamation paradox or Simpson's paradox. Positive association becomes a negative association. It is also a great example of another paradox, another thing that also ails us all the time, the ecological fallacy. And I have fallen for it constantly, right? You cannot infer, you cannot make an inference at the individual level based on data that is aggregated at the national level. Because again, you may be witnessing an example of an amalgamation paradox. So we need to pay attention, because if you don't pay attention, you will jump to conclusions. This is what happens. You see that, you don't pay attention, you read it too quickly, your brain automatically creates that mental description. You want to believe that because you're a cigarette smoker, and you use that chart to confirm what you already want to believe. How to avoid that? Well, there are certain books that can help us become more aware of how cognitive biases operate, how they work. For example, the wonderful Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me by Carl Tavares, who is a wonderful cognitive psychologist. The Enigma of Reason, which is a great introduction to cognitive biases. It's a little bit more technical, but also highly readable. There are also books that talk about how to become more mindful and about how to become more attentive to what you see out there and to what happens unconsciously here in the back of the brain. There's a reason why mindfulness is becoming so popular nowadays. This is one of the latest books that I have read in relationship to this topic, Buddhism Without Beliefs, which is not really about a book about Buddhism. It's a book about paying attention. That's what it is about, right? So it's very important to train ourselves to pay more attention and help other people to also pay attention, because otherwise we will be misled by all these charts. And the last recommendation, we need to become more ethical. Right? This is one part of the conversation that I feel that is missing in books that I have written myself or read about data visualization, the role of ethics. I would like to go back to what I said before about designers, readers, and mediators, right? Nowadays, we can all be any of these people, but certainly we all are mediators. All of us are mediators nowadays. Why? Because we are all in social media. We're all on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. How easy it is, and I know this again because I have done this myself, how easy it is to retweet or to post on Facebook or Instagram a graphic that you really like because it confirms what you want to believe and spread it out over your network and don't think twice about it or not look at the source of the data or not reading it carefully. Am I reading too much into this chart? Am I projecting what I want to believe onto this chart that I'm seeing? That's mindfulness at work. We all need to grow used to doing this more often. That's the whole reason I wrote How Charts Lie, to encourage people to become more attentive to charts. Why is this so important? Because if we are all mediators in between things that we see and the people who follow us, our networks, friends, family, or whatever, everybody else, we are all journalists in some sense. We are all people who gather information that we see and spread that information. Therefore, if there is an ethical mandate in journalism, sometimes it is not fulfilled, of spreading information that has been verified, perhaps we should also learn, all of us should learn to do that a little bit more often, to verify what it is that we see every day. There is another wonderful book, the last one that I'm going to recommend here tonight, titled The Elements of Journalism. It's a great introduction to the world of journalism, right? It talks about journalism. The key sentence in that book is that the essence of journalism is a discipline of verification. Verification is related to attention. You need to pay attention in order to verify, right? You need to consult the source, you need to talk to people, you need to think twice, you need to read beyond the chart, you need to ask yourself whether you're reading too much into that chart. Recently, I realized that this sentence could be repurposed. We could change this sentence. I have come to believe that as long as we are all, in some sense, we are all nowadays journalists because we all spread information, I would say that the essence of citizenship is a discipline of verification and a discipline of attention because we are all spreaders of information and we all have a responsibility to improve the informational ecosystem that surrounds us. That's the theme in the last part of How Charts Lie, is a call to attention to how important it is for us to all contribute to the improvement of these information ecosystems. That's all that I have to say here today. Thank you so much. And before I call the panel to come up, can we bring back my slides just for a second? Can we bring back my, sorry, I'm trying to talk to the people back there. Anyway, you will not see what I'm doing, but I'm going to tweet out the slides. See if I can, oh, there you go, here I am. Let me see if I can see my own cursor. There you go, I see my own cursor. So I'm going to go to Twitter. Even if you're not on Twitter, by the way, you can go to twitter.com/Alberto Cairo, my name and my last name, and you will be able to see that tweet that I'm going to send. Tweet. Oh, I'm not online. I will try to do that while the panel comes up here. So I would like to call everybody else up here. Again, thank you so much for coming here tonight.
That makes it easier.
All right. Thanks, Alberto.
Thank you.
That's great.
All right.
So we are going to chat for a little while, and someone's going to tell me when I need to stop. So let me just introduce our panelists real quickly, and then we'll get right into it. Directly to my left is Amanda McCulloch. She's a data visualization lead at Excella and board member of the Data Visualization Society and some high-ranking falutin thing there.
I'm the operations director.
Operations director. In the middle is Laz Gamio, who is visuals editor at Axios. Over there is Ali Torban. Ali is a data visualization designer at the American Enterprise Institute and is one of my DataViz podcast buddies. She hosts the DataViz Today podcast, and of course, Alberto trying to tweet out slides.
Yeah, it's already there.
It's already there. All right. So great. So let's start with the following. So we just heard Alberto talk about graphs and charts and other illustrations that mislead. And I want to start with asking, when it comes to your own work in the variety of places that you do work, what processes or checks do you make sure that you are accurately and clearly visualizing your data? And I think I'd like to start with Laz, because as the guy who's pushing stuff out every day.
Yeah, so is this thing on? I think it is, yeah. So at Axios, last time I checked, we make about 160 charts a month, which is a lot. Nobody has died yet, which is good. I think the biggest thing that we have found when, having this like large volume of things that we're making is that the best chart is a bad chart that you never made. So we try to do a lot of work before we even open Illustrator to evaluate whether the data set that we're tasked with charting is good, right? Like sometimes data is just bad and should not be charted. So that would be the biggest lesson. Just evaluate the data set before you even decide to start designing.
Amanda, you want to?
Sure. So I spend a lot of time developing dashboards and tools that take a bit more time. So not 160 a month or even a year sometimes,
Oh, man.
but probably that many charts. And we spend a lot of time doing rapid prototyping early on, drawing pictures, trying to get a sense of what people actually want to see and how they're going to understand the information. I was in Uganda last month doing a dashboard MVP workshop where we built a really rapid MVP of a dashboard and let people interact with it, because I was designing for and hopefully with these community organizations who have a very different level of graphicity or visual literacy than perhaps I do. And so it's important to understand how they see what I have built, and I get feedback from them and understand where we need things like simple data-driven legends that help people understand how to read a chart. And that early stage feedback, I think, is critical for having a final product that someone not only can use, but really wants to use.
So Ellie, you're in a similar sort of place that we are here at Urban and are working with the researchers and the design team. So maybe, so you can talk a little bit about how you all think about that and how you go back and forth between the two groups.
Yeah, I'm probably in between you guys. I'm probably making something about once a week, and definitely prototyping really quickly is something that's really useful. And also having templates, so you don't forget, the arms, the legs, of your chart. You make sure you have your title, your subtitle, the source, annotations. Make sure you don't forget any of that good stuff. And also something I think that I would probably like to get better at, you make sure one chart is good, but looking at it more from like a quality assurance perspective, because I'm not the only one that's making charts there. So making sure that everyone's kind of following the same process and we're testing in the same way, making sure the way that I see one graph, other people are seeing it that way too. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I can try to get better at is helping other people test their charts. A lot of people just like putting their data in Excel and sliding down the defaults and being done with it, but just understanding that it's a process and you're climbing the stairs up to your visualization and you need to test along the way. I think that will help the whole organization create better charts.
Okay, great. I want to go maybe a little broader. We know there's sort of an onslaught, an attack on science and research. There's the fake news term. Alberto, you used the word undermined, which I thought was a really nice word to use with that NOAA example. And I'm curious what you all think how researchers and analysts and data scientists and all the folks are here, how we can use data and data visualization to, I think, in some ways regain the public trust. And maybe I'll ask Alberto to start to expand on that thought of undermining.
How to recover trust,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I have no idea. and I don't even think that data visualization and graphics alone will achieve that goal. Because if someone is predisposed not to believe you, no matter how much data you throw at them, they will still not believe you. And they will actually use those facts to confirm their own beliefs. They will twist them in a way that fit into their own internal narratives. I go into that a little bit at the end of the book when I describe what several experts in persuasion and cognitive psychology say that is the best strategy that we can adopt to people who don't want to believe facts and reality. There's a wonderful book titled The Unpersuadables by Will Storr, who talks about people who are completely refused to look at evidence and they just want to hold their own beliefs. That will be one example. There is an ebook, great ebook by a cognitive psychologist in the UK called Tom Stafford, and Stafford with 2 Fs, Stafford, and the book is titled For Argument's Sake. That was very illuminating to me because that book contains several papers in which he describes certain techniques that you can use to undermine the certainty of other people. People who don't want to believe are very certain of their own opinions. That's why they refuse to look at facts. So, for example, let's suppose you're facing a climate denier, someone who wants to refuse that sea level is rising. I would invite those people to come to Miami and see reality happening in front of your eyes. But anyway, that will be one strategy. But what he says in the book is that when you're confronting something who refuses to look at information or who has very solid beliefs about certain things that you think that are wrong, don't begin by showing them facts and data and graphs, whatever. Just face them, sit with them, and very friendly ask them, oh, that's so interesting. Why do you believe that? Can you explain it to me? Asking them very openly and in a friendly manner to describe their own positions in a well-argued way, right? Without, without using arguments from authority or without using no, I saw this, the president said it. No, just explain it to me factually. What do you think? Where does this belief come from? Because the book explains that, and I think that it is true, that once you do that, you plant the seed of doubt. It's like, oh, my opinion is not as solid as I thought. I go beyond that recommendation in the book, though, and I say, because I'm so interested in mindfulness and biases, etc., to apply this technique to yourself. So look into your own beliefs. If you believe anything, I don't know, increasing the minimum salary is great for society, or increasing the minimum salary is going to reduce employment, whatever, right? Argue with someone, why do you think that? Because what many of those books explain is that our opinions are not formed based on the data that we see. We don't see data, analyze the data or evidence, and then we come up with our opinions. It happens the other way around. First of all, we form opinions in an emotional manner, in particular if those opinions align with people who we like or people who belong to our own group or to our own ideological tribe, so to speak. And then we gather facts to confirm those opinions. But you can break that cycle. And you need to begin with yourself. That's the key thing. Because then once you do it with yourself, you may be able perhaps to start doing it with others. The last thing is that people will not believe facts alone, but they will believe facts if they are presented by people whom they trust. So the key thing is to put a human face to the data. One of the reasons why Hans Rosling was such a beloved figure, it was not because he was a great data presenter or because of the beautiful graphics that he showed alone. It's because he was an extremely friendly looking fellow. I mean, it was so fun, yeah, and he made you laugh, etc. That builds trust. It's like scientists and experts and people like me, sometimes we sound too serious, perhaps. And that sort of like creates a barrier with with friends, even with friends and family, and people who don't know as much as we do about the things that we care about.
So Ellie, you work at a place that is out there trying to make a case and make an argument. How do you think that we can regain people's trust in what we're doing?
I think that I don't think that one chart can regain trust, but I do think that we all are probably used to really marketing your own work and like being loud about your work. But one thing that I think might help us all get more trust back is being a little bit more loud about our mistakes. That article from The Economist, if you remember it, it was mistakes, we've drawn a few. And she picked out a couple of examples and said, we probably misled some people with this chart and this is what we would do better. So I think being a little bit louder about our mistakes, I think people are like thirsty for that, for someone to say, hey, I was wrong. I think that would be well received. And I think that is probably a good step to regaining trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that we try to do every day is just being careful about what you can say with certain data, what you can't say. I think it's really dangerous to be overly confident in your assertions. So, just label it. It's really simple stuff, like sending people directly to the data so they could explore it themselves, right? To be completely transparent about what you are doing, what you're not doing. And labeling or just mentioning any limitations of the data. I think data and charts have this sort of aura of being really scientific when really they can just be an approximation of reality. And just acknowledging that up front is important.
And I agree with everything that's been said, especially around, I think, empathy and understanding where people are coming from, like Alberto highlighted at the beginning. I think those of us who are in the weeds of numbers and data have a bit of a moral responsibility to actually be the ones having hard conversations with people in our own families or our friends, and then not step away from those, but to lean into them, but from a place of empathy and understanding. I'm from the Midwest. I have a very wide range of different political viewpoints when I go home. And I think that it's part of our responsibility to help to share better quality information and have active conversations, that when grandma brings up a chart or a graph she saw on a slightly or very misleading journalistic source, that you're willing to have a conversation with her and try to understand why she thinks the way that she does. So I think we have that responsibility. I think we also have a responsibility to make sure the data we're showing is good quality, and that the text and the language we're using to wrap around our charts and graphs is accurate and specific in terms of what someone can take away. I really like some of the work that's been done by Cole Nussbaum or Naflick around trying to do more headlines around our charts and graphs, so that even those who are looking at a chart and aren't quite sure how to read it can still see and understand what the key takeaway is. And I found that that's a very effective way to try to help people understand and start to see how to read charts more effectively.
Amanda, you're a convener of sorts, running the DataViz group here in DC and on DataViz Society. So when you're working with people who are like all of us in this room, like how do you, is there a way in which you can push like these communities forward in the way that you're talking about? Like how are those conversations going on when you have all these people in a room?
So I think there's different spaces. So in a room, I think that we try in DC through DataViz DC to convene different events that feature different kinds of visualization and for different levels. We try to have events that are accessible to people just interested in DataViz and people who are actively designing and creating those tools themselves. So they're usually much more focused conversations. With the DataViz Society, looking more broadly and looking at how we convene people globally to have these kind of conversations. One of our aims is to create and foster a space for dialogue where people feel like they can bring questions to the forefront. They can ask about how to do things better, how to visualize things better, how to learn. We have a dedicated critique channel for people to get feedback. And I really am very proud of the fact that we have a lot of people willing to post their work there and actively get criticism and critique. And also to foster the kind of conversations that we have on topics in DataViz, where we try to dive deep into topics like accessibility or data ethics in dedicated, moderated conversations where someone's saying, I know a lot about this topic, and I want to help other people understand it and come along. I think creating those open and accepting spaces is really important to make sure people feel welcome.
Yeah. Ellie, do you ever have this on your show? I have this on my podcast every once in a while where I'm like, I need to push back on this person. Like, do you ever, like, and there are lots of podcasts out there where we have these interviews, we try to be friendly and let's have a discussion, but there are times when you just want to push back. So do you ever have that experience when you're interviewing people, or even just setting up an interview?
In terms of what they're, like, I don't agree with what they're saying. Yeah, I think that the longer you're in the DataViz community, you realize that there's a lot of different opinions. And I'm an open-minded person. I'm always willing to be persuaded one way or another. So, I like to dive a little bit further into why they think that way. But I'm not really someone to push my ideas on someone else, so I think you're probably more.
Could I persuade you that pie charts are awesome?
In certain situations.
There it is. There's the gray area.
There's always someone has whatever you think is bad. Like, I found that radar charts. I did an episode on radar charts, and I really liked a particular visualization, and then I was researching about it, and I realized like a lot of people hate radar charts, and it's really just because a lot of people use them in ways where their data didn't really fit a radar chart. So I mean, it depends. So.
One other thing. Oh, sorry, Amanda, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I do think there are times, though, when pushing back is important. I think we saw that most recently. There was in the Tableau community, they have Makeover Monday, and the recent data set was around suicide. And that's a really sensitive, challenging topic, and one that when you're visualizing that data, what you're visualizing and showing, there is research sharing that by people seeing other people who are taking their own life. I know I'm using the language wrong, but this whole conversation was about language and about the words that you share, how accessible you make a call to action, and what the impact of your visualization is important. And Bridget Cogley, who's a Tableau Zen master and a wonderful person in the DataViz community, she shared a blog post saying, here are the things you should think about. And a lot of people revised their submissions for this weekly challenge group because of the fact that she said, what you've put out there, when you think about it, could actually cause harm. Right. And if we're putting things out there and we're posting things on our blogs or our websites or portfolios or Tableau Public, when you put something out there, even if it's just for practice, it can have an impact. And you have to think about the people who are represented in each of those data points and those numbers, and what someone could take away from that if they're in a place where they're at a really tight situation and they really need to be able to have a way to reach out for help.
Yeah.
I was going to sort of like follow on what I was saying before, that so after I finished writing How Charts Lie, I immediately started writing a new book, which I'm co-writing with a friend. And one of the things that I want to talk, one of the themes that I want to touch upon is that I feel that for many years, data visualization has been taught as a set of rules, like do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. And that's the reason why we have sort of like this mindless opposition to pie charts. Pie charts are bad, don't use them. Well, because very famous books say, don't use pie charts. Pie charts are terrible, they're dumb, whatever. I don't like that.
Do you want to
approach.
list the authors of those?
I mean, there are many. Even myself, I wrote that years in the past, right? But throughout the years, I have become, so the more I read and the more I learn, the less certain I become about what I know. Just because perhaps I follow, that advice of like, have a conversation with yourself. Are you really certain that, pie charts are bad? Well, no, they are not that bad, depending on how they are used, obviously. You need to be super careful. Same thing with radar charts. I think that in most cases, radar charts are badly used, but there are certain specific cases in which I have done a radar chart myself that I think that it works. So the framework that I'm trying to develop in this new book, and I don't know how long it will take to finish writing it, is that perhaps there needs to be a shift in the way that we teach data visualization, that we forget we need to teach data visualization perhaps more like we teach writing. So writing is taught through explaining grammar, explaining symbols, but once you explain those foundations, everything else that you do on top of that needs to be based on reasons. This is the way that I wrote this because of this, because of this, or because of that. A reason is a fact that counts towards making a decision. That's what a reason is. So we need to base our decisions more on reasoning. I decided to use a pie chart because I read this paper that says that pie charts that have like 2 or 3 segments may be good for this and that. That's a good reason to use the pie chart, right? Or I use this particular graph because, perhaps it's a little bit less effective than this other chart, but it has a huge visual appeal, so I want to attract people. That's a reason also to use that sort of chart. Mm-hmm. The problem is that this kind of reasoning needs to happen in a conversation. That's why I think that what you said before about testing graphics and about talking to other people is so important. Because one of the books that I forgot to mention in the presentation is called, I don't remember, but one of the ones that appeared in the cognitive biases slide deck, slides in which I recommended several books. There's one that describes that knowledge is not something that happens in individual brains. It's something that is distributed. Mm. You cannot assume that you are like, the super expert in data visualization. Your knowledge doesn't reside only inside your brain. It resides in the community. That's why, for example, the culture of critique, of gentle critique that the Data Visualization Society and other venues are trying to foster, I think that is so important, to put your work out and have it gently critiqued by other people. Obviously, don't be an asshole. Try to be constructive, right, when you critique other people's work. But, that's a very important part of the conversation and of the process of reasoning about how to develop better visualizations.
So we've mentioned, this is like getting into the DataViz weeds, which is always super fun. So we've already mentioned a few of these like charts that maybe not. And so I think it was in the Truthful Art, maybe, you had this ranking diagram. Mm-hmm. That was based on a lot of research by
Cleveland
McGill, and Hare, and Bostock, a lot of people. So at the top of this ranking is your charts that enable us to make precise estimates, so bar charts and line charts. And at the bottom are charts that enable us to make more general estimates, so things that use volume or color, something like that. So how do you all make the decision between a bar chart that enables you to see these exact differences versus something that's a little more engaging? And I want to start with Laz, because one of the things that I really like about the work that you guys do at Axios is that you often give us a lot of data in a lot of sort of non-standard forms. Mm-hmm. And I think oftentimes, from my perspective, it works really well. And the one that I show a lot of people is this B-swarm diagram about Trump properties and spending around President Trump. So I'm curious how you all think about using these different forms.
I think you can pretty much convince yourself to turn any visualization you ever are tasked with doing into just making it like a table. Like you can sort of work yourself, yeah, it should be a bar chart. Like it should just be a table. How about you just don't do it? Even easier. Everybody wins.
Right.
I think choosing more challenging forms, we try to make that call if there's value in showing more data. Usually these things are interactive, and you can sort of engage the reader a little bit more by showing them something that they haven't seen before. It's really easy to ignore a bar chart because you see hundreds of them a day, probably. If you see something a little bit more novel, I think you're more likely to pay attention, which is important. And if you make it interactive, if you put effort into crafting it well, you may have sort of hooked a reader who is going to go down and click on everything and read all the filters and read the whole story. So typically the first call is there enough data here? Is there enough depth in this data set where it makes sense to sort of blow it up and make something interactive? And as far as doing things in sort of weird forms, like I made a while ago, this thing, the turn off emojis for the whole 50 states based on like health metrics and stuff. And it's like, okay, well, like, it's just really just indulgent. Like I just want to make turn off emojis, right? But with that, there was like an emotional connection with how the emojis were made. I think, readers aren't going to take out a tape measure and measure all of your, marks on your chart. They're going to sort of get the feel of it and take something else that maybe isn't necessarily a number, just a general sense of the entire data set.
What I will say about that particular map, so if you haven't seen this, it's a map of the 50 states, and each state has some happy face emoji. I show that map when I teach fourth graders at my kids' elementary school, and every time I show it, without fail, they ask why the people in Colorado are so much happier than us in Virginia. And it's not appropriate to tell them why, but I do find that that's what they pick out every time.
It's because of the mountains.
Right.
Quality of life.
Quality of life, yeah. Allie, how do you think about this difference in these different forms?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of your work, Les, because I think I probably am more open to kind of new forms of visualizations. I feel like that kind of moves the field forward. I think that even if maybe what you experimented with didn't really end up working out for you or whatever, someone else seeing it might get an idea, and it might work amazingly for their use case. So I'm a big fan of experimenting, but like day to day, I think for me it kind of comes down to audience. In this situation, what's the graphicacy of the audience, how much time they're going to be able to spend with the visualization, what's the magnitude of the consequence if they get it wrong. So I mean, like if you're trying to land a plane based on my graph, I'm going to be basic.
Tables it is.
Yes. So, and also the frequency at which this person is going to be looking at the graph. So like if it's, I think of something new and amazing for someone to land a plane with, but it takes them some time to understand it, but they're going to be using it 10 times a day for the next 10 years. It's worth putting in that effort to figuring it out first, and especially if it's the perfect way to display this information. So like, I think that it really just mostly comes down to the audience.
Well, and I feel like you hit the nail on the head with audience and also use case. When will it be used and for what purpose, and how quickly does someone need to be able to use it? So I think that the way you've contextualized that, Allie, is perfect.
Can I also ask you to expand a little bit, Amanda, because you've done a lot of work in Africa and Uganda, and I'm curious about if you've seen any cultural differences in how people read charts and graphs between here and the work you've done there.
When working in other countries, I've worked in over a dozen countries around the world, and across the board for environments where there's a lower level of understanding for how to interpret and use charts, I find that even helping to someone understand how to use a what might seem like a simple iteration on a chart for us is very complex for someone who is still getting accustomed to using bar charts, for example. I remember being in Botswana and I was running a training for the Department of Health there on a data quality audit tool. And there was a dashboard, and almost every chart on the dashboard was a bar chart. And the bar charts made sense, and in the training, they all made sense. Everyone could understand what the information was saying about the accuracy and timeliness of the data. And then there was a gratuitous radar chart. Sorry, Ellie. There was a gratuitous radar chart, and it took a whole animated series of slides that showed, to Alberto's point, how to teach someone how to read that chart. And the functional reason it had been added was for, I think, novelty, to add something that was not a bar chart, to be frank, on the dashboard. I hadn't built the tool. I was training on someone else's tool. And it was challenging because people kept asking me, well, Amanda, but why could this not just be a bar chart? And the functional answer was, it could be, but it's here for novelty. So I think that's where you have to think about how much time and effort is going to be spent by someone learning how to use it, and how much have you empowered the team who you're working with directly in those countries to also help to teach and train other people how to go ahead and use and interpret those charts. It's one thing to sit in a room for 2 days at a workshop and train someone how to read, I mean, even a dumbbell plot or a tadpole chart, a bee swarm plot, and teach them how to go ahead and read them. But to give them a way to understand it in a way that they can then teach other people who have even less knowledge about those charts and graphs, that to me is the question on kind of how you make those decisions. From a culture perspective, I think a big part of it's just more around kind of education and how people learn. I think the color piece and how color is used, I see come out a lot more than chart type in culture. The enthusiasm for stoplight colors is never ending. The red, green, the red, yellow, green palettes. And at some point, sometimes you just say yes. You say, you know, in this context, this makes sense to you. And I'm going to be okay with it and find a contrasting level of red and green that'll work. Right. I find that oftentimes it's those pieces, it's iconography that's very different in culture. How do you create and identify or select culturally appropriate icons? Thinking about what those things mean and look like to someone. National colors mean a lot, the same way we might look at a chart or a graph and say a red, white, and blue chart has some implication to us here in the US. How do the national colors associate with local political parties? Those kind of things matter a lot. So I've seen a lot more of the cultural differences on things that you might expect might be more culturally influenced. Yeah. Icons, thinking about the language on the chart, what language is it in? I mean, is your text in English or something else? Right. All those different pieces, but less with the chart and graphs themselves. That's more around how do you understand how someone reads it. Okay.
You mentioned a few different types of education, and I'm curious, we have representatives, I think, from a variety of different fields up here. So we've got data journalism, we've got the academic sector, the nonprofit sector, the data science sector, or however wherever you'd place Excella.
I'll take it.
I'm curious, what other fields or industries can or should we, as working with data, should we be learning from?
Designers.
Cartographers. Cartography is an obvious one. One of the things that I discovered the hard way, like almost 10 years into my career, was how bad my early maps were. How badly designed they were, because I had never read about cartography. And so I would say cartography for sure.
UX, I think.
Yeah, it's a big one, yeah. Human-computer interaction, human factors, UX, that's all essential.
I try to look at more art, like painting. I don't know. I think you know, I try to do that with my own work, where it's just like be a little bit more expressive. Like, don't start a project thinking like, this would be great as a bar chart, or this would be great as like a scatter plot. Right. Sort of take away those rails and see, I mean, invent a new chart, why not?
Yeah.
I mean, I would say look to the people who are experts in their field in different social sciences and people who aren't data people, not looking to people who are data people. You can't build great charts, you can't write great algorithms in the data science space without having subject matter experts who can advise you on what the data could mean and what you should look at and what other data sets you should blend in. So I think we should be leaning on and finding ways to create more cross-functional teams that bring in that kind of subject matter expertise.
So before we get to questions, I want to spring one last question on all of you. So what is the biggest challenge that the data visualization field faces? And I think I know what Alberto's going to say, but
I don't know what to say.
I mean, isn't it how not to lie with charts?
Yeah, perhaps helping people understand charts better is what I describe. It's like bringing everybody else up to speed. It's like stop focusing so much on the newest kind of chart, newest, wonderful toy that we invent. We certainly need to keep creating new things, to work with. We need to improve the craft. We need to invent new graphic forms. That's certainly true. But I wish that more people put a little bit more effort on everybody else. It's like everybody else. Just because the whole purpose of visualization is to be read by other people, right? Not only by us, by everybody else, right? So that's the biggest challenge. Yeah.
A question that I hear a lot is how do you communicate the value of creating visuals, creating charts? And I mean, I don't have the answer. I wish I did. I mean, it's very nuanced in different situations, but I think having a broader discussion about the value that visuals and data graphics bring to certain organizations. And like, I was at an astronomy conference this past weekend, and a lot of people were talking about how do we show that we bring value to the community by visualizing space. And I think that's a huge question, and that deserves more attention and research.
Yeah. I think part of it is something that we're trying to do is just being more transparent about everything that goes into making a chart. I think people see the final product of like a beautiful visualization, a beautiful map, and then they don't realize, like, you know, the 80% of the work that went into that happened before it was beautiful, right? It was just like all the grunt work of either, you know, collecting the data, cleaning the data, and I think sort of being more vocal about all those other things you have to do before you have a great chart.
I took my words. I think the data prep piece is really important. I think also being more mindful of just the ethics around what we do. I think we have started talking about that and having a broader conversation, but the fact that when we present information visually, it's seen more as fact, even if someone doesn't take the time to read it, means that what we create and put out there in the world matters. And I think bigger conversations about the ethics and about what we're building and what we're creating is really important, and one that has to cut across tools and sectors. I think the democratization of data visualization tools is wonderful, that I can dump a table of data into a beautiful tool like a Flourish or a data wrapper and have a beautiful click-ready chart, but that also empowers people to make really misleading and terrible charts, which is actually why I think Alberto's book is so well-timed and so important, because that democratization of tools also makes it really easy to create terrible and awful things. And so I think we need to think a lot more about ethics.
I would like to add a little bit of what Man said about the consequences. Remember what the first book that sorry to recommend so many books, by the way. I'm not so sorry. We should all read more and pay more attention to what we read. The first book that I recommended was Mike Montero's Ruined by Design. The quote was, "We need to care about the consequences of our actions." He's talking about technology companies, right? But we can apply that to visualization, right? One of the cases that I wish that I will be able to describe in the new book is a case that happened after the shooting at a school in Connecticut. What was the name of it? Newtown. Yeah, the shooting at Newtown. There was a newspaper in upstate New York that published a map plotting dot by dot, person by person, people who had gun permits in New York, pinpointing the location of the house of a person having a gun permit. What is the reason to do that chart? What informative purpose does that chart accomplish? Is it ethical to do that, to disclose the locations of people who have gun permits? We need to think deeply about that. What are the possible consequences of doing that? What is the consequence of plotting that data at that level of granularity? Wouldn't it be better to aggregate the data at an upper level and show, for example, different shades of color in areas without putting sort of like the spot on specific people? That's the consequence. That's thinking about the consequence. And again, it's all related to reasons. What is the reason for doing that? There is no valid reason to do anything like that.
I mean, let's take that even further. Like every time there is a mass shooting, like what's the first thing that people do? It's like they compare this mass shooting to other mass shootings, or they talk about the weapons used, and it's sort of, I mean, it goes back to the ethics. It's like, is that what we should be focusing on? I don't have an answer for that.
I wrote an article about that. So at the beginning of my career, I used to produce mostly pictorial graphics for places like El Mundo and in Spain. And when, what was that? Sorry, something. All right. So, so when the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq happened, we produced tons of graphics related to the war. Many of them were about the weaponry that was used in the war, and very few were about the victims of the war. Why did we did that? perhaps it was because it was easy to find information about the weaponry, and we could model the tank, and it looks so cool, etc. It's like now in hindsight, taking a look at my back work from a distance, it's all crap. And it's like, what is the reason of doing that, other than practicing with the 3D tool that you really like, right? It's like, why shouldn't you focus much more on the consequences of those events, right?
But you call it a very good point on what data was easily accessible and available. And so sometimes that's what gets visualized, and what gets measured gets done, and what gets measured gets shared. And so I think the question of how do we responsibly use open data in a land of Kaggle and all the other big open data competitions, how do we ethically kind of use that open data, think more meaningfully about it, and think about what data is not represented? I mean, Invisible Women is a great book if you want to dig into kind of the ways in which a whole half of society is not represented in a lot of data. And so who's not represented in that data and information? And in a lot of cases, it can be the victims, and it can be very sensitive to share out that kind of information.
Okay, so we'd like to open it up to questions from you. There are microphones around, so raise your hand. Please let us know who you are, and let's just try to keep it to a question rather than some long, meandering rant or statement. So if you just raise your hand, we'll just start there, right here in the blue.
It's like the first time ever that I've ever gotten the mic first. Hi, my name is Elodie, and I'm the communications specialist at the Embassy of Rwanda here in Washington, D.C. I'm so glad that we touched a lot on the intersections of DataViz and journalism in your talk. Thank you very much. And here's my question. How can DataViz professionals be more ethical in representing populations and cultures that they are not familiar with in this era of first come, first served when it comes to producing and distributing news? Thank you.
That is such an excellent question.
Go ahead, do you have the answer?
Try.
Go for it.
I think a big part of that is how do we think about who has the right to and owns the data that's being visualized. I think it's one thing to take a World Bank data set off of the World Bank Data Bank and visualize some country or regional level statistics. It's different, especially when you're starting to tell stories that include pictures or imagery or any more personally identifiable information that might be sensitive. When the example came up about guns and pinpointing gun locations, I immediately thought to work I'd done in HIV, and that we would never map individual households that had HIV. We would not do that because ethically it wasn't right. So I think it's a question of data ownership and who owns telling those stories, and how can we as DataViz professionals be more inclusive and provide more resources to those who actually are part of those data sets themselves so that they can learn how to practice this craft too. That's a big part of the DataViz society, and a big part of our goal to become more geographically diverse is having dedicated outreach and goals of increasing our diversity and inclusion to be a home for the one person doing data visualization in their organization. I mean, I've worked with a lot of CSOs where you have one monitoring and evaluation professional who's the one person who has maybe 10% of their time to do data visualization. I was spending time with one of the women I've known for 3 years now from Uganda, and she's super passionate about DataViz, but doesn't have someone locally who's working with her on it. And so offering up a space where you can say, I'm looking for resources, I'm looking for tools, I'm looking for advice, and hopefully having people take advantage of that opportunity. I think putting the control and the power of building the visualizations in the hands of the people who are represented in that data is really important, because that's where the best visualizations and the best stories are going to come out.
I mean, that's perfect. I mean, it's like, I don't know what else to say.
I would love to know what you think we could do better, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I'd love to know,
Yeah.
is what could we be doing better as a DataViz community to better ensure those people are represented? And you can decline to answer. That wasn't a fair lob back to you.
Yeah, wasn't prepared for that question, but I think maybe a little bit more of what people can do is we tend to be a little bit more removed from the impact and the emotions that we cause when it comes to populations that we are a little bit far removed from. So kind of bring that home and thinking about maybe an issue that's impacting you in your own area. So I'm very impacted at how people visualize genocide and what happens around that, because I am from Rwanda. So I think with many various different issues that are happening around the world, just giving it that second thought, and also looking very closely at where your data is coming from, because if it can be very biased depending on who's looking at that. It's very easy to pick up an economist paper and saying, oh, I'm sure the economists did their their fact checking and research on this. So it's very easy for me to just pick up from there and rehash this information, rewrite it in a different way, and distribute it to my audience. So just taking that extra step to look at multiple sources for your information, and then bringing it a little bit more home to think about the impact of what you're about to produce. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. So one thing that we try to do is you should always treat a data set like you would a source. So if you're interviewing somebody for a story, you typically have background on them, right? Like, who are they and why are they telling me this? And I think if you take that same rubric and you apply it to a data set, you should know, okay, who is the organization collecting this data? Why are they doing this? How else is this data set used? And it's a good method for sort of deciding whether, what you can do with it.
And always remembering that in general, data are people. That's the thing. It's like, I'm talking to the people who are represented by the data. Again, I'm speaking as someone who hasn't done that, but I look at my own past work, and I realize I should have done it. I should have talked to people in the communities that are being represented by this data set and talk about how they feel, how are they well represented, what they feel, how they feel about that, right? So I don't know. I don't have formed thoughts about that, but I think that it's a very important topic.
But to both of these points about talking to people in the community, I wonder if, Laz, as a journalist, you can tell us a little bit, like, how would we, as an analyst who's working on some issue we're not familiar with, like, how should we feel empowered to just call someone?
Yeah, I mean, why not? People love to talk. Like, we're here now. I think, there's no reason to not just talk to somebody who is smarter than you in a given topic. I think no harm will come from it. And I think if you come to it from a position of like, hey, of goodwill, like, I am working on this, you know a lot more, please educate me. I think very few people will turn you down.
On the flip side, there's the emotional labor component, right?
Yeah.
So if we're asking people who are from disenfranchised communities to spend their time, how are we considering how we compensate them for that time and consider that? Which I think it's a great idea, and I like the goodwill approach, and you often will have willing participants. But if I'm asking someone who is from an underrepresented community in the U.S., for example, on a story about parents who work 3 jobs, do I want to take the time away from someone who's already spending their time working 3 jobs to answer questions about a data set without offering something in return that recognizes their time and their emotional labor? I think that's something we all have to be considerate of and mindful of.
That's true. Although if you do it one time, perhaps that can educate you on how to do it better in cases that are similar to that one. So you don't need to bother people in every single case, right?
Sure.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Other questions? In the back, go ahead, and then we'll go up here.
Hi, I'm Nate Mannion with ICF. There are motivations for making visuals besides communicating insights. Sometimes that can mean trying to put on an appearance of sophistication, among other things. And I'm wondering if you've encountered that in your own work and what you've done in that situation.
Man, that's hard.
Well, I'm an economist, so 95% of graphs that economists make is just to show off how smart they are. So,
I mean, I think Alberto mentioned something where, like, in news, for example, like, if a story has a chart, that news item is more lucrative and valuable because people love charts and people like to click on charts and consume them and make me ad money. I think the way to fight that is you should, like, charts are not decoration, right? That's like a big mantra we repeat. A chart needs a reason to exist, and that reason cannot just be I need something for the top of my article. So I think that's. I mean, it's maybe not a great answer for you. I think just follow the steps of why are we making this chart? Is it solving a problem for somebody? Is it illuminating anything? The best chart is a bad chart you never made.
Yeah, I think that, I have people come to me a lot saying, hey, I've got, this data set and I kind of want to, visualize it. And then usually I start out by, okay, what's the goal of this visualization? And a lot of times they haven't thought about it, A lot of people think, I have data, so it must be in a chart form. So I think just knowing that having that conversation is probably a great prerequisite to creating that chart. A lot of times you can talk someone out of it. A lot of times someone has said, yeah, we probably don't need a chart for this now that I think about it. So I think talking about the goal of it can help. Sometimes people talk themselves out of needing a chart.
Hi, Will Angel. I help organize the DataViz DC meetup with Amanda. So what activities should we, as the experts in the room, be taking to increase graphicacy and increasing people's levels of knowledge around graphs and data visualization?
Having conversations with people. It's like, showing graphics to friends, to family, to people you're familiar with, and have ongoing conversations about them. Help them, again, bring themselves up to speed and understanding that graphics are not just illustrations, they are ways to convey information. I would say, though, that also connects to your question before. That graphics sometimes, not sometimes, very often, they also have an emotional component. The other day I drew a diagram, actually, I may redraw at some point, in which I said, I sort of visualized that some graphics tend to be, some visualizations tend to be more exploratory, some visualizations tend to be more explanatory, but some visualizations tend to be more experiential. They are more expressive, and there is nothing wrong with that. As long as they are also informative as well, there's nothing wrong with casting attention to the data that you're trying to present. I don't know, there are many ways in which you can do that, through talks, through presentations, through articles, through tweets, social media, etc. There are multiple ways in which we can do that, and we can all contribute to that purpose.
I mean, something I try to do is like de-romanticize it as much as you possibly can. Like people call like DataViz people like data samurais, or like like chart ninjas.
Yeah.
And it's like, dude, man, I'm just like filling out a spreadsheet here. Like it's like so. It's like as long I think the more you could do to just show them that it's
not
when I
magic.
say the F word.
Yeah.
It's just effing work. It's like it's just a lot of painstaking, grueling work, like anything else in the world. The more that it'll become more approachable, and I think people will just understand what you do better, and mistakes will not get made.
Yeah.
Writing about your process too. I know you have your classes do it,
process,
and
yes.
it's, creating a podcast and having to form my thoughts in a coherent manner every week and fill 20 minutes of space. Just having that thought, like, okay, every week I've got to have something to say, and it has to mean something, and I have to learn something, and I have to teach something. That is an amazing exercise to learn and to connect to people.
And have people visualize things. It's like ask people. So I have this story that I usually tell in classes. So you probably all have heard about the R programming language, which was created by the Department of Statistics at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Who said that? Yeah, there you go. So the same department, also people in the same department, they also created a wonderful tool that you can all use called Insight. With a Z, Insight from New Zealand. Yeah. You know Insight, right? Yeah, of course you do.
We teach bootstrapping in high school in New Zealand.
That's what I was about to say. It's a tool that was designed to teach high school.
Interview.
Yeah, great. I love Insight.
I was so embarrassed to tell them, no, we teach this in New Zealand in high school. It was really horrible.
Yeah. Well, Insight is, but for teaching children, it's a great tool. It works on the browser. And it's fun to use, it's easy to use. So you don't need to teach the programming to visualize things, right? You can use Flourish, you can use Data Wrapper, you can use Insight, there are many tools out there that you can use to teach other, again, it's not magic, right? It's like, here's a data set, here's how to interpret it, here's how to visualize it, and there you go, here's the graphic, and here's how to read it, right? Once you sort of you go over that barrier, I think that people tend to understand again that visualization is, if you learn how to write, if you can learn how to write, you can also learn how to visualize, right? So it's not that different in that sense.
Other questions? Back here and then.
I'm Elsa Schaefer. I make iDidio, which is a data-driven career in school site. And I went to a talk recently at Public Data Users Association where someone from the New York Times said they don't get people interacting with their interactive graphs.
Nope.
And so you had the same experience.
Nobody clicks on anything.
So,
Ever.
are there lessons learned? Are we wasting our time when we make them?
No.
Because we think, oh, people are going to love this. And
So, life is sad. That's end of talk.
Quote last, yeah.
End of talk.
End of talk. Thank you for coming very much.
So, So like people like, there's another statistic that says like, like most news articles, when people open them, they never scroll down. They literally like open it, read the headline, look at the photo, and then just leave, which is also sad. Gregor Eisch, formerly of the New York Times, had an amazing article where he, he sort of shot back at that, which is, well, this is why you should make it interactive. And a couple of principles, like if your chart needs to be interactive to be understood, you're doing it wrong. So, before you have that interactive layer, you should have a nice solid static chart. That interaction is there for like the 5 or 10% of readers who really want to learn more. And if you can service all of your readers and give them the top level information, but then if that 5 and 10% of very, very interested humans, if they can get all the data and get even more insight and experience it more fully, then I think that's a great plus. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's all.
Okay, good.
Aaron?
Hi, Aaron Williams from the Urban Institute. I think there's been a lot of increased awareness about the importance of reproducibility in social sciences. A lot of this focuses on statistical estimation, sharing code, sharing data, and things like that. What role does this play in data visualization? How can we be more transparent about how we actually make the things we share?
Do you want to go first? I spoke too much already.
I mean, at Axios, whenever we have like a project that we sort of came up with ourselves, like there's a couple of things we do. We try to have a paragraph that's just labeled how to read this chart. Like, okay, this is exactly how you should interpret it. You have all the tools about the data, right? This is what we did with like these 3 data sets to combine them, blah, 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 blah. And then whenever we can, we just link directly to a prepared data set as well as all the source data sets. And if we can, we even give you the code that we wrote to reproduce it. So I think just giving people all the tools to reproduce what you did is, I don't know, a good first step. I have nothing else to.
So maybe let me expand on that. So I don't know what the card looks like out front. So no, it's okay. So we have, there was an opportunity to put stickers on your favorite tool. And I know where Aaron's going with this, so I'll just hit on the head. So there's a lot of people in this room who are Excel users and Tableau users, and maybe there's 1 or 2 Power BI users. All those tools are for the most part drop and drag type tools. And I think that the question that Aaron's getting at is, if I create a dot plot in Excel and I post that somewhere, I can't necessarily post the code. I can post a step-by-step guide, but that's a lot of work, right? So for those, maybe for those groups, what should a strategy be?
So I work a lot with a lot of the tools that John just named, and have worked with
Power
those
BI
for,
too?
I've worked with Power BI,
Okay,
yes, yeah, I have. I think that part of that for me is the documentation that wraps around anything you build. So if it's in a tool like Tableau, Power BI, Excel, that there's some kind of documentation, that you follow best practices around how you actually design your workbook. So if you're in Tableau, for example, you can annotate all of your calculated fields to what they're doing and how they're running and things like that. So you can add those kind of annotations, which on the Viz Candy blog, she has a post about kind of how to help your colleague when you get hit by a bus. That you can still have someone else who can actually run and understand your workbook, that functionally you're putting in enough annotation and information that you can actually go ahead and hand this off to someone else. Because it's not just about reproducibility externally, right? We all work with a lot of data that we aren't publishing onto public-facing websites that are for different clients or for different audiences that are smaller and more niche. And so the question to me is also, how do you create something that you can hand over to a client? I work at a consulting firm. How do I give something to a client that they can go ahead and take and run? I don't want to be staff augmentation and be at a client for 5 more years. I want to give them something they can own. And so all those annotations and the documentation that wrap around it, even if it's something that isn't entirely code-based, is important. You might have snippets of code, the queries you wrote to pull the data, but then have additional documentation on the different graphs, charts, visuals, the usability testing that you did, anything else that can help someone else understand how they can own and use that workbook.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Doug Caldwell, and I had a quick question on the hurricane charts. So it seems to me that those charts are gifts from scientists to the public. They use them, they understand them, they interpret them. And based on what you've said, there's an incredible amount of mediation required for people to understand them. So my question is, has anyone looked at it from the user side? What information do they need and what would be helpful to them?
Yeah.
As opposed to what are the scientists giving them?
Yeah, myself. And we are looking into that right now. I'm part of a research team right now at the University of Miami that it's a combination of communication people, UX researchers, atmospheric scientists, etc. And we are looking into that. But the National Hurricane Center has also looked into that, and the NOAA, the National Weather Service. And they put out products, maps and charts that address those, address the risks and address the possible impacts. If you go to the National Hurricane Center, they had like a huge collection of graphics, etc. Now the question is, why is the cone so popular? It's not because the National Hurricane Center pushes it out, it's because journalists like it, because it looks so easy to read, right? Again, deceptively so, right? The other charts that they put out, the risk of, storm surge or flooding, whatever, they're like these sort of choropleth maps with, tons of little shades of colors. Like, they take a little bit longer to explain, but they are highly informative. They are not as popular in news media, again, because journalists perhaps are a little bit lazy, and we don't want to explain, and we need to stop being lazy, because those graphics are highly informative. So the answer is yes, yes.
Do you have a preferred alternative?
I don't have an alternative for the cone. Actually, usually when I talk about the cone, the reaction of most people is to say, why don't they design better graphics? Why did they use the cone? Whatever. I say, well, give it a try. You give it a try and see whether you can come up with something better. Because many things have many options, many different alternative designs have been tried out, and all of them open the door to certain kinds of misinterpretations. My current reaction, or my current idea, my preliminary, and I may change my mind in the future, is that the cone itself may work. I mean, if you explain to people how to read it. And we have actually seen that. Like, people who have lived in Miami for like 30 years, and at some point they were exposed to an explanation of how to read the cone properly, they don't forget it. They already know what the cone is showing, right? It's people who see that map for the first time, or people who had never been explained how to read that chart that misinterpret that kind of chart. That's the reason why mediators are so important. That's the reason why we need to show and tell, because it increases the level of graphicacy.
Yep. I think there was a question back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rob Tufts. I'm with the U.S. Green Building Council. I also write about hockey for the site St. Louis Game Time. And this is a follow-up kind of about the interactivity. There was a dust-up in a little obscure corner of the internet known as Hockey Stats Twitter the other day, where someone proclaimed, one of the Hockey DataViz guys proclaimed that making interactive data visualizations was like a photographer allowing a viewer to reframe their photograph, right? Like recompose their photograph, as if kind of like data visualization should be a statement from the designer to the viewer, and that's it, one way. I was just curious about your thoughts on that sort of concept.
May I reply to that at the risk of speaking too much? Because it connects to what I said before about different types of visualization. Some visualizations are exploratory in nature, some of them are explanatory, some of them are more experiential. If you're doing a visualization that is explanatory, by all means, frame what you need to show, etc. Just explain what you need to explain. But that limits you if you only do that. I mean, some visualizations need to be exploratory, just because you want to allow people to discover their own insights in the data and explore the data in different ways. So that's limiting yourself, I think.
The guy's wrong.
Yeah. I mean, on the simplest level, if I've got one chart and I want to be able to view it 3 different ways, why wouldn't I want to have a drop-down menu that lets me pick which segmentation I'm doing? I mean, at the simplest level, if not going into very complex data journalism, why, if I can and know that there are 3 different kinds of questions, why would I build 3 different interfaces or 3 different charts versus letting someone go ahead and pick those comparisons themselves? That seems like a person who wants to disempower their end user.
I can give you a hockey example. So I had fun data on who scored last, or the number of times that teams score in the last minute of each period, that I got because my son kept scoring on me in Xbox in the last minute of each period. So I want to know what the real thing was. And I ended up just creating sort of the basic graphs, mostly about the Washington Caps. And then I asked someone, Brittany, to make an interactive version for me for someone who wanted to know about the St. Louis Blues, right? And so there were two different levels of the visualization. So I'm with Laz on this one. That guy's wrong. You should block him on Twitter. Yeah.
I think you can have it both ways too. I think a lot of times you want to frame the shot for yourself, so have a static version, and then you say, hey, if you want to explore the data, I did the interactive below, and so you can do both, I think.
It's more like picking the cover image of a photographer's portfolio.
Yeah.
Like we pick our cover image and the first thing you see, but then I want to give you lots of other pictures and images to go through and see that there wasn't just one way to frame that shot. Unless you're submitting for a Pulitzer, most of what I see photographers doing is taking more than one picture in a given location. So I would reframe it that way.
Wow, that guy's lucky he's not here.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Is he?
Yeah. Over here.
Hi there. My name's Ethan Green. I'm with Gartner, and I was curious, what are your thoughts on the level of data science knowledge that every person should be required to have in order to adequately read and understand the majority of your work? Should you be doing more of the work for them and explaining? Should we be expecting everyone to reach a certain threshold? And if so, what is that threshold?
What do you mean when you say data science?
So math, statistics, the core fundamentals of how you got the data, how you analyzed the data, manipulated it to get to the point that you're trying to visualize.
Not linear algebra.
No.
Perhaps basic descriptive statistics. You know, just beginning with the difference between the mean and the median, which we all take for granted, but many people don't get. Right? It's like, but again, one thing is that we cannot talk down to people. It's like, if someone doesn't understand that, you can explain it. It's like, what is the difference between the median and the mean? And you can explain it besides your chart. That again will increase the level of understanding of people. So basic descriptive statistics, you know, measures of central tendency, spread, etc. You know, distribution stuff. That's sort of like the, I would say, bare minimum. Perhaps a basic understanding not only of like statistics but also of cartography, so how to interpret a map, right? Maps are sort of like sometimes overlooked a little bit, and I have plenty of maps in the book just because they're very often highly misinterpreted, right? So perhaps a better understanding of how to read a map. But again, we need to meet people in the middle. Right? It's like we cannot talk down. We cannot oversimplify. Oh, people are stupid. I'm going to make this as simple as possible, even at the risk of oversimplifying. People are smart, and we need to basically appeal to that intelligence, right? We bring themselves up, challenging them a little bit, perhaps sometimes. Anyway.
I would take a stronger and more controversial position that Ben will hate. That I would replace high school calculus with statistics.
Yep. Yeah.
I mean, I can't.
I would replace geometry with statistics.
I mean, almost. What? Why not both? Yeah, I mean, maybe at least calculus. I don't remember the last time I, took an integral of something.
I would say that you flag what I think is a terminology challenge that we have, which is that data science is a pair of words that are thrown around to mean a lot of things. Whether you're applying for jobs and looking for a DataViz job, and the best way to find one is looking for data science jobs or something else. And I think it can be a scary pairing of words, because for a lot of people in the wider audience and the wider audience of people for data visualizations, data science can imply much more higher level mathematics. And so for me, it's a question of, as we make things more accessible, how do we talk about things in more appealing language? Like, should you understand kind of basic statistical functions? Should you understand basic comparisons or relationships between two things? How do we make the language more accessible? And when we mean data science and machine learning or AI or something else, let's say it that way and talk about it that way.
Anybody else? Yeah, Brittany, and then right here.
Hi, I'm Brittany Fong. I'm an independent consultant, and I also organize the Tableau user group. Going back to efficacy around charts, I think part of that is education, and I think the start of that is really with kids that are now in school. So do you have any ideas about how to get them interested in that, or any experience with that?
I do, but see if
you have some experience with it.
Yeah. You've done it.
You can talk about that. I have some ideas. I don't have experience, but I have ideas.
So
but he has experience.
So I've taught my kids in elementary schools, their various grades, the last 3 or 4 years. I would say kids they soak this stuff up. And we are all, taught how to read line charts and bar charts and pie charts. They learn how to read histograms, which is kind of amazing to me. And the reason a lot of people don't know or understand a lot of the other graphs that we make is because they're not exposed to it. So part of what I do is I try to teach them how to do it or read these different graphs. The other thing I do is I play card games with them. So kids, they like competition. They like games. I'm working with someone now at a university. We're doing an evaluation of not my kid's grade at the elementary school, but we're doing an evaluation of whether whether gamifying playing with DataViz enhances and retains learning better than, say, doing a little like handwritten exercise versus just looking at a lecture. And there's a lot of this sort of research out there. Cody Borner, who's at Indiana, has done a lot of this on museum work. And one thing that she's done is she'll have kids collect their own data, which I know a lot of people sort of do as well, but she's done it in the museum setting where she'll have kids, they'll have to run some number of yards and they get timed, and they combine that with their age and their gender and whatever other questions she asks, and then they have to sort of play around with it and make data. And I think that goes to your point earlier, Alberto, about it's the various encodings. Once you learn what a dot is and how it's spaced, then you can build on top of that. But I think there's competing thoughts on, do you teach the encodings or do you teach the different graph types? Do you teach kids how to make something, or is it just how to read something?
Yeah.
So
I'm working on something related to that. It's one of the things that I'm working on at the moment, and I don't know when I will finish working on these. You know the pudding? The Pudding. So The Pudding is a website that collects like visual essays. You should all visit it because it is wonderful. It's pudding.cool. That's the URL. So they have this project that they published a number of years ago, a project about the variety of the size of the vocabulary of different rappers, rap musicians. And it's sort of like a bee swarm plot with the faces of the rappers over a horizontal axis, fewer words, more words, right? It's a wonderful graphic. So it really appealed to me, even if I don't like rap music that much. My kid does, but my kid does. So I said, well, that's maybe an opportunity to get children interested in all this crap. So I said, why? I got this idea, and the idea is the following: we can take the data from the pudding because it's publicly available. What about if I get like a bunch of magnets, right? Then I print out the faces of all these rappers as stickers, and I put the stickers on that. And then I bring sort of like a metal panel, something like a board, like a metal whiteboard, to a classroom, and I draw a horizontal axis, and I ask the students in the classroom to say, well, what do you think that is a rapper that uses more words in his or her lyrics? Plot them over here, and have the children have a discussion. Oh, now, Kendrick Lamar uses more words. No, let's move him over here. Yeah, let's have children talk about that. And once they finish plotting the rappers over that graphic, show them the reality. Show them the actual data, and perhaps use one of these tools that I mentioned before, Flourish, Insight, whatever, to create the actual graphic and compare it to their own assumptions. So I'm working on that example right now. I have another one that I want to create with Marvel movies. To explain scatter plots. So for example, Rotten Tomatoes scores versus a box office, right? And then you plot, again, stickers with the magnets and the faces of the characters, the Avengers, whatever. Just plot them on the chart and have children talk about that, right? It's like, what do you think that was a movie that made more money, right? And it will be a fun discussion. Again, I don't know if it will be fun. It sounds fun to me. But these sorts of ideas sometimes don't resist the test with reality. But I think that kind of approach may work because it's related to data that interests them. That's the thing. It interests people, the people that you're talking to, right?
Data about them. Oh, sorry. Data about themselves too. My daughters are 4 and 6, and they're obsessed with themselves. So we've been. My older daughter just started kindergarten, and she's been a little bit tight-lipped about what's been happening during the day. So I was like, because she knows I kind of do DataViz, and we have your cards that they like to play with, and I was like, we can make a word cloud about it. And so we just listed all the things that she did today, and I was like, let's size them by how much you like doing them. And she absolutely loved it. So I think talking about themselves, doing that whole movement about collecting data about yourselves is like the perfect activity for kids.
I think one of the challenges that I see facing us and facing us more widely is that all of these activities sound so fun and wonderful and engaging, but how do you bring them into a curriculum in a school? And that's the big question that I have. And I think part of that my mom's on the school board back at home in Rockford, Illinois. And so we have a lot of conversations around kind of where are those opportunities in terms of how you actually bring these kind of things beyond just a workshop someone's doing or the thing that the super engaged, involved parent can do during their time at home and bring them into how we teach kids. I think that's a lot bigger conversation that's opening up, but still really has to get unpacked to make this kind of learning accessible, not just to those with parents who have a DataViz background or understand how to do these things, or happen to be lucky enough to be in a classroom where a parent comes in and does that, but rather makes it more accessible. So I know for DataViz Society, one of our big 2020 goals is around helping to develop curriculum modules that can be open and accessible and available that people can use and adapt to their own context, because sometimes building up those curriculum pieces is a really just big hurdle to get over to even start to incorporate these into teaching. So more to come on that front.
Hi, I'm Sana Ferreira, and I'm a public health scientist at the NIH. Thank you so much for all of your insights. I'm very excited about DataViz. I'm also an artist, and so I'm coming at this from some curiosity about wanting to know how we can continue this conversation about democratizing data visualization and making these tools accessible. So I'm wondering where is a good play space or place of experimentation for someone who's really interested in bringing some of these ideas of data visualization to our individual workplaces and just having a place to explore that as a tool for communicating the work we do better.
You should join the DataViz Society. Step one, it's free and open, datavisualizationsociety.com/join. Also, if you come talk to me afterwards, I've got stickers in my pocket. Very hard to find stickers. But it is a space where there are open channels on different topics. There's a topic health channel that if someone wants to join and have a conversation about visualization and health, there's people who want to talk about that there. There is soon to launch, preview, exciting, a dedicated tools channel, not to talk about any one specific tool, because our goal is to be tool agnostic, but because there are lots of questions that come up around the different tools in this kind of ecosystem of data visualization. So what works well for different contexts. So really active, vibrant Slack community where all those channels live and exist. We've got newsletters, we've got Twitter, lots of ways of pushing out information. We also welcome people coming in and saying, I want to moderate and lead a conversation for a 2-week moderated conversation. And you can pose questions as someone kind of trying to find ways to bring more data viz into your organization, and we would welcome that. So happy to talk more afterwards, but I feel like I have to give that shout out, and I really believe in it.
And local meetups, right?
Yes.
Local meetups, and because the problem with the Slack channels is that they can be overwhelming a little bit, and I experienced that. Yeah, they can be very. Yeah.
So if you lead a local DC meetup, can you raise your hand? Okay, so
there you go.
The DC Tug. Our Ladies DC and Data Plus Women, and then the DataViz DC. Anyone else? Did I miss one?
I mean, I would nudge you broader than DataViz DC.
Yeah.
If you're not connected to Data Community DC, DC2, it is an umbrella 501c3 that has over a dozen different meetups on different topics, on stats, data science, data viz, all different things. So if you're here in the DC community interested in data and not connected there, if you go to, if you Google Data Community DC, you'll find our website that has an events calendar. Great space to engage and also get connected locally and get kind of a digest of a lot of the local data-related meetups.
One other thing that's internal, so at Urban we have a lot of different groups. We have two of our organizers of our users group, so it's a tool specific, but it meets every Friday for 30 minutes or an hour, I guess depends on what we're doing. And it's a place that people can share what they're doing. You know, we have people at the inside who will give a talk about something that they're working on. Aaron and Ajit, who are right there, they'll tell you all about it. They always ask for like, what has someone made that's made something cool this week? You know, share that. So it doesn't have to be public. It can also be internal. It's just about building these small groups. I think we have a DataViz group and we have an R group that they all start small and then they kind of broaden as you get more people to buy in and interest in their groups.
Have a book club.
Yeah.
About Alberto's book. We've done that in my at Excel.
So many. That
He'll send you
Have a
free
book
books.
club.
The entire NIH.
Or there's even a global open DataViz book club, DataViz VIS, because it was not started in the US,
Yeah.
different spelling.
Yeah.
But there's a global open DataViz book club where authors will come and have conversations. Alberto's done that, run by one of the folks at Data Wrapper. So I think book clubs can be a great place to start to have a conversation about these topics.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Maria Brock. I am a student at George Mason, and I also teach Tableau workshops on my campus. One of the problems that I've run into is that when I approach students that may be from different majors that aren't tech at all, they get completely turned off. They don't care. You know, they might think, oh, data, that's not something I'm into. I'm an English major. I'm a policy major. So my question is, how can you reach out to students or get them to at least understand that since data is the new frontier, like you have to have some sort of data literacy? How can they start with that? How can they, you know, without getting too technical, how can they just kind of get some skills, get some understanding of data visualization and charts and all that type of stuff?
I would lead with free food. Always. And that doesn't matter if you're on a campus or at a place like Urban. Free food always works.
My students come from many different backgrounds, so more and more I'm getting students from engineering, from mathematics. Those are obviously interested in data already, but I also get students who are communication majors, who, people who are scared of classes that say data, whatever, and they're like, ooh, data, that sounds so scary. So what I do is to show examples, and for example, I draw examples from the digital humanities, for instance, graphics that plot historical data or that count the number of words in certain books, etc. And I try to show them the value of doing that, right? It's like through examples. It's basically through examples, and then if possible, then play with that sort of data on the very first day, or the first week of class as soon as possible, so they can lose their fear. And again, one of the first sentences that I say in class is that, first of all, this is a journalism class, and journalism is not what you believe that it is, because journalism is not what journalists do, and journalism is not something that happens exclusively in newspapers. It's like all of us are journalists in some sense. And second of all is that this is not magic, which is something that I explained before. And I'm going to prove this to you. Let's do it this way, right? So I know it sounds vague, but perhaps showing data that is related to that kind of student that you're having in your classes.
Yeah, any kind of quick win, I think, like you were saying, like make it something easy. Collect, 4 rows worth of data on yourself. Something really small, really easy. Get it into a bar chart and be like, oh look, whatever. Just as soon as you can demystify it with something so small and easy, I think that's a slippery slope into a gateway drug into data.
I have nothing of value to add. This is all good.
All right, I'd like to thank Alberto, Ali, Laz, and Amanda for joining us. Thank you so much, everybody.